remarks, Monty, you said that each generation has to, quote, invent its own faith. Is invent really the right word? How about revitalize or discover? If each generation has to invent faith, why should we be concerned about what happens to our faith? So the question about reinventing as opposed to revitalizing or discovering.
I would just ask, what's the difference between invention and discovery? I'm not exactly sure. Aren't they, I mean, did Thomas Edison discover electricity or invent electricity? I'm not seeing the difference there. Yeah.
I would say that's true. Tesla was, written out of history. That's for another panel. Okay, so I think I would reframe the question around like what does it mean to be human, and discovering more of what it means to be human. And I feel like that has been my journey. So that's how I frame it, right? So like what I've been going through, it means more. Is more for me what it's like to be human. What have others in my own like genealogy, like my fellow global citizens, what have they experienced as human beings, and what can I learn from them? So that's how I would reframe them. So I don't think anything is new. I think a lot is available for us, but it's for us to maybe discover. I don't reinvent. I don't know about that. So.
And I think to sort of go off of what you're saying is that that's an important question because it's always changing with society. I mean, like that question can't be answered the same today as it was, in the 1800s, and it's going to be in 2040 or 2050. There will be different answers to that question, and I think that's why that question should be the center.
That's a good point, because 50 years ago, like, we wouldn't be on a panel. Your panel would not look like this.
The panel would be very different.
Yes.
I think the question also kind of almost betrays a concern for consistency across generations. So you ask a question about revitalizing something when you want to preserve that thing. You might ask a question about invention or discovery when you're concerned about experiencing or opening up to new possibilities. But revitalizing and refreshing are projects that you do with something that already exists and that you want to preserve. Discovery is what you do when you are out there on the boundaries of what you have experienced already and are looking to bring something new into the human experience. So Edgar's saying you can't revitalize beyond the confines of what already exists. So the two projects are very different in focus, and I think part of the challenge is historically, at least within the last 60 to 80 years within Adventism, we've been a revitalization project, and many of us, not all of us, but many of us are challenging us to become a discovery project. And I think Adventism in some ways did start as a discovery project, and then 1910, 11 happened and we became a revitalization project.
I mean, another perspective, I think, very similar to that would be to say that as a restorationist movement, our concern has always been to go back and get to the core, the pristine, platonic, perfect thing, and try to embody that as best we can. And I just, that's just not, I guess, the philosophical framework that I would approach the question with. I don't think there is such a place. I don't think you can get back to people who talk about the apostolic purity or even the way the book The Great Controversy is constructed implies that there was this apostolic purity that we can somehow get back to. And I just don't think, as you say, that's a very different kind of thing than to say, where is the Spirit leading us now? Which is what I think the book of Acts begs for, when the book of Acts sort of ends and it's an unfinished project.
But given the community, as Keisha is pointing out, we are a community, and we are 15, 20 million Adventists now, and most of those people believe, because they've been taught, that there was this golden time that we need to get back to, and you people here tend to be on the cutting edge of that larger community. is there room for the great masses that think differently from you? Isn't that, if not the nub of the question, isn't that a very pressing element of this discussion? Is there room for you, few, perhaps us few, and all of them?
Yes. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to point to the peaceable kingdom as a potential vision for the church. In the book of Isaiah and in the book of Revelation, the prophets point us to a situation where the lion and the lamb are coexisting. And I see an Adventism in potential, not in fact yet, but in potential, that includes both the person who has been acculturated to look back and the person who is kind of empowered to look ahead. And between the two of them, because of a common shared vision and concern for the world around them, not as an escape pod, but as a site for service, they work together. They use the best gifts of each, and each participant in the whole uses their best gifts to move the entire church and community forward. And instead what we kind of have with the dichotomies that Courtney talked about is a limping along on one peg of the stool. And I don't think that is serving us very well. It's functional, but not flourishing.
Okay, here's a question that's related to this. How hopeful or pessimistic are you that Adventism in the future will sufficiently change that you will feel accepted?
I would say under current leadership, extremely pessimistic. That's it.
Okay, anybody else want to have a try at that? Alfredo?
Sure. I'm very I'm very curious about how societies evolve, and like we were talking about earlier, like things are very different now than they were 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 500 years ago since the Renaissance. So it's like if you look at history, like things need to adapt. Like the Catholic Church has done a great job at adapting. You know, when Mexico was colonized, like the Virgin Mary came about as a fusion of indigenous beliefs and Catholic beliefs. So, if you look at history for social groups to survive, like you have to change, or you become smaller, So I think the Adventist leadership just has to make a decision about that, and like you said, because we are hierarchical, we do have people that hold this power. They have to make that decision, and I think we do have a long way to go. I don't know if I feel optimistic or pessimistic. I think it's going to happen sooner or later. So if it's next year, or if it's 100 years ago, 100 years from now, so be it. But I think it's going to happen sooner or later.
Maybe the only question is how difficult it's going to be. So you can change, and it can be very, very painful, or it can be less painful, and it increases in pain the more you struggle. And I think that's one of the things about the dark night of the soul, where you can push against the grief and be in the denial or bargaining phase for as long as you like, but you don't make progress unless you accept what's happening, and you accept that a change needs to happen, and you put yourself in a position where you can get the support to move forward. But if your starting point is that you know all there is to know, or you have to hang on to everything you already have, then forward movement isn't possible, or it's much more difficult than it needs to be.
A couple years ago, a few of us at the Hollywood Church, under the inspiration of our friend Rajiv Sagamani, decided to celebrate Great Disappointment Day as like a liturgical holiday. And I don't know if I flipped this off or what, but and the idea there was that the Adventist Church was founded in failure and ignominy. And we thought, well, that's a really great way forward, I think, Like, that'd be a great way forward in terms of being able to say, we were wrong, and our movement began out of recognition of how wrong we were, and we're not afraid of being wrong again. But I don't think the church is ready for that. I think to disentangle these things is highly unlikely. So I'm more with Edgar here. I think that the thing will polarize probably, and there will be people who will retrench into what they feel comfortable with. There'll be people who want to be essentially humanists with a kind of spiritual varnish, and I don't know.
I see, Syd, were you going to say something?
No, I was just going to say, I think that you guys were doing that crazy celebration like maybe my first, second, or third Sabbath when I arrived, and I was like, this place is really weird. So if you want to believe in the Holy Spirit and the work of the Holy Spirit, it's like that must have been what kept me there.
Here's a question, speaking of the dark night of the soul, this talks about being at rock bottom. Do you believe that it may be more beneficial for a person to go to one extreme or, quote, rock bottom, and return to become a person at peace with being a traditional Adventist?
Is being a traditional Adventist likened to being an alcoholic? I mean, that's kind of the language that I'm hearing. Is it an addiction to be a traditional Adventist? Is that the question?
I don't think that the writer of the question had that in mind.
I read it one more time.
Do you believe that it may be more beneficial for a person to go to one extreme or rock bottom and return to become a person at peace with being a traditional Adventist?
Well, I guess I like the second part of that in being at peace. I mean, I think everybody should be at peace with wherever they land. So if the alternative is not being at peace, then I'm not for that. And I think I'm thinking that maybe the question is asking whether or not it's okay for somebody to go to whatever lengths they can to find themselves and find where they are at spiritually. And if that's the case, then yes, I think everyone should, like Keisha was talking about, the different levels of spiritual development. I think everyone should go throughout those stages of development, and if you wind up being stagnated just to avoid having to go through that, then I think that's not a place that anybody should be or anybody should be comfortable at. You should want to explore whatever it is that God is asking you to explore in order to finally make peace with it. And I don't think that it necessarily has to rest at being a traditional Adventist, but if that is where you wind up, then that's good. But I think the journey is the important part of that, and not necessarily the fact that where you end up is where everyone else would end up, if I'm understanding the question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I read the question in terms of experience and whether we are free to experience. And I think even within the traditional Adventist model, this whole existence is about experience. So one day, God decides to create a creature that has the capacity to choose and experience wild extremes. And God creates this creature knowing that in the act of creating it, there is the possibility that this creature will spin off and become very unruly and unmanageable. And yet this God creates this creature with that capacity in a context where there is contrast and expects us to learn through the experience to choose the good. That's a way of reading the traditional Adventist view of man and the great controversy. So I think even within the Adventist worldview, there is a valuing of experience and a valuing of learning through the contrast, wild differences in experience that I think is valuable. And you don't learn unless there is contrast involved. So yeah, you can stay in the same situation and congregation type all your life with exposure to the same kinds of information, and that's okay, I guess, if that's what you want. But there is a world of experience that's available to you, and it's quite possible that it might enhance your life. So why artificially limit yourself from accessing that?
Thank you. Here's another question. Why is it so important to have an identity that aligns itself to any system, such as Adventism? And then the questioner brings in the issue of truth, whether we are responsible to find the truth or whether the truth finds us. I'm not quite sure how those two elements come together, but that's the question. Why is it so important to have an identity that aligns itself to any system, and such as Adventism? And then the next question has to do with truth. Are we responsible to find truth, or does truth find us?
Maybe I'll respond first and say, like, I used to think that I could be like a really, philosophical person and read a lot of books about philosophy, but I can't. I just can't handle it. So what I would respond to that is, like, you're a human being and you need to be in community. Like, really try to go out. What's that movie where the guy goes out into Alaska and then he gets lonely and he dies? Into the wilderness. Try it. It's already been done. So we, as humans, let's just start from that point. We need to be in communion with others in community. So it's not about identifying with the church or not. It's like, you're a human being. Like, this is how whether you believe we evolved over millions of years or whether you believe God created us, we have always been with others, and our identity is related to the other, not to some, like, system. So, so that's how I would reframe that. It's like, okay, you're a human being, so you need to have some sort of identity, whether you're a father, a kid, whatever. You need, and it's that identity is created through others. So that's how I see it. And I don't know if you want to call that truth or not, but that's what I feel as truth, with my body, with my emotions, with my spirit. If you want to use my intellect can go crazy and start talking about, like, all these philosophies, but the truth that I feel is that my identity is rooted in, like, all of you, and my sister, and my family, so that's how I would respond to that.
I think we tend to be tribal creatures, evolutionarily, but also, in modern times we've held on to this notion of being tribal, and I think that it gives us some social benefits, but it also presents us with some real social liabilities as well, which is that we tend to define our tribal groups over against other groups, and it's almost unavoidable. It's interesting, the vitriol within the atheist community over, the idea that being an atheist would be an identity, and people are really conflicted about that. It's kind of funny. And so the interesting thing about that is that, being an atheist is the only, people will tell you the only unifying characteristic is that you don't believe in a God or gods. And so any attempt to herd atheists together is a little bit challenging. So I think that, but we do tend to want to, I just went to this atheist church on Sunday at 11 a.m. I'm sure they picked that time just out of the sky, Sunday at 11. And it was like church, there was this group, we sang a song, I Can See Clearly Now. You may have heard of it. And there was a talk by a scientist, which was really interesting. I wish they had given him more time. I'm one of those church members who could, you can leave off a couple songs and let the guy talk a little longer. But there was an icebreaker that was super uncomfortable. Super uncomfortable. I'm like, God forbid us to ever do these kinds of things in church where you have to get up and talk to your neighbor. I know I've done those things. I'm sorry. I repent. Because now I'm in the pew, so to say. Oh, so much like church. But we tend to want to be these tribal grouping together people, and maybe it's part of our human nature to do that, as long as it's not at the expense of other people.
I was going to say, I think that inherent in that question is kind of this idea of being individualistic, and everybody likes to believe that, they're an individual and they come up with their own ideas, like, nobody can tell me what to do, I think for my own, and whatever. And, you choose on your own, but I think that it might be kind of arrogance to believe that our thoughts we are the ones who come up with everything that we think originally. Like we're just so original and like we totally don't subscribe to anybody else's philosophy, you know. But the truth is, and sometimes you hear people like throw the word sheep around like an insult, like, oh, you believe what somebody else believes, well, you're just a sheep or whatever. And I'm like, you know what? Truth be told, everybody's a sheep. Everyone might have different shepherds, but everybody's a sheep in some way or the other, because every philosophy and everything that everybody believes has been based on something. You didn't come into the world like totally original and blank and just come up with your own thing. Everybody draws from their community, and you pick the community eventually that makes you most comfortable and that resonates the most in your own mind and your own spirit. But that community is a construct of so many other ideas of other people, and you can't avoid the fact that we are influenced by other people. Whether you want to claim that or not is your own, but I think that the truth of the matter is we are all interconnected. You know, we're not rocks or islands or anything like that, even if we want to believe that.
We've been here for over 3 hours now, and we think that it's time to bring things to a conclusion. But if any one of you has some salient point that you haven't been able to get across, and this is your last chance.
And I just wanted to add
Yes.
one last thing about identity, and like what I found is, so the reason I like made my talk around like finding pieces of myself was the idea of fragmentation and the idea of integrity of your identity. So finding a community that accepts you as a whole being, which is ironic, right? Well, I don't know if it's ironic or not, but that Adventism talks about holistic viewpoint, but then they don't want parts of me. They don't want the gay part of me, they don't want the too ethnic part of me that has a problem with colonialism. I can't talk about that. So I need to be accepted with my whole self. I cannot not bring my history into the room. I cannot not bring my gender identity into the room. I cannot not bring my politics into the room, because all of this is me. So identity for me has to do with completeness, wholeness. So that's one thing I wanted to say. So as a gay man, it's not just being a gay man, because I think that's I'll let other people fight that battle, but it's my whole self.
Thank you. Let's say.
I just wanted to say one thing.
Yes.
That was something that Keisha had said. She said, "Who wants to pastor the church, the next church that's in this transition or whatever?" And personally for me, that's kind of the only church that I want to pastor. I don't want to pastor a stagnant church. So.
Best of luck.
Keisha, did you have? Yes, please.
The point that I want to leave the room with is that we have a choice point right now as a community, not just the church administration, but all of us who participate, whether as members or as former members or people who cluster around the word Adventist and come to events like this. We have a choice to make about whether we stay open to a range of people, or we shut up the doors and kind of hunker down and wait for Jesus to come, because we can do that too. But I just want to say we have an opportunity to keep growing as a community and to share our growth with others who are growing in the Christian and secular worlds. So we can take that.
Edgar, please.
If I could make one final point, sorry to be that guy, but I think in the response, he was sort of talking about how we as Adventists love critical thinking, and we accept critical thinking. And I would like to challenge that with responding with, look at our universities, the one place where we should have critical thinking. We are running into, these walls and these problems when teachers are suggesting thoughts that slightly vary from this, idealistic, perfect way that Adventism is supposed to be run. And if we're getting that at our university level, how do you think it's going on at our elementary level, our congregations? If we're getting that in a university, and I attend a liberal arts college, what's happening at, the more conservative universities like Southern or Andrews, which aren't liberal arts? If Alvin Fulton can't talk about stuff that he'd like to talk about in his classrooms at a liberal arts college, and, we're supposed to be Advent, we're critical thinkers as a church, we're the church that started on doubt and stuff like that, then what kind of people are we sending out into the world and stuff like that? That's something that I would like to leave with.
Well, you've given the leaders of Adventism a lot to think about, because our church still tends to be quite hierarchical, and given the great numbers who don't think like you, and those of you who have, as one of you put it, we're a problem because of your success. And if Adventism hadn't emphasized education and health, we have some rather unique doctrines that could have made us, maybe not like the Amish, John, but like the Jehovah's Witnesses or our friends, the Christian Scientists, but not the sort of dichotomous denomination that we are. We've created our own challenge, and it's up to our leaders to grapple with. That's right, because on the women's ordination issue, we had division among our leaders, and the population in the Columbia Union and the Pacific Union and a few other unions are making a significant difference. It's pardon me, I'm getting old. I'm thinking in the old paradigm. Anyway, let's thank our 20-somethings. Thank you for coming, and